Hey, MBA hopefuls, and welcome to MBA Waves. We are on the air. We are your weekly vidcast talking all things business and education, streaming live every Tuesday on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube, bringing you tons of tips to help you get into top-ranked MBA programs and bring you up close and personal with some top-ranked MBA programs and meet professionals from all around the world. And don't forget, if you like this episode, don't forget to like and subscribe to MBA Waves. Today on episode 98, we're talking with Katelyn Stephenson and Katelyn Alford, about something on a lot of people's minds. What is the deal with the deferred MBA enrollment programs? Is this the way to go or not? And what we're going to talk about today, we're going to get into just what is a deferred program, if this would be a good strategy for you or not, and how to be a great applicant for a deferred enrollment program. As always, I'm your host, Eric Lucrezia, joined by my co-hosts, Bara and Krithika. How you doing, guys?
Hi,
Doing
wonderful.
good. Great to see everybody.
And I'm going to let first Katelyn and then Katelyn introduce themselves. If you want to just say your name, which company you're with now, where you're from, where you're based, anything you'd like to share just to get us started.
Sure. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Katelyn Stephenson. I'm happy to be joining you all. I am based in Washington, D.C., and I am currently the early access team lead and an MBA prep coach for Management Leadership for Tomorrow, MLT, which is a U.S.-based organization focused on promoting and helping to support increasing underrepresented minorities in the world of business.
I love it. Thanks, Katelyn. And also with us, we have Katelyn Alford at UVA Darden.
Yes, thanks, Eric. Hey, everyone. I'm Katelyn Alford. I am on the admissions team at the University of Virginia Darden School of Business, which is based in Charlottesville, Virginia. I've been working in admissions now for 14 years and more recently have resumed responsibilities for Darden's deferred enrollment program called the Future Year Scholars Program.
Amazing. And we love Darden. So listen, we're going to go around the room and ask some questions to the room for anyone to answer. Of course, as our guests, Katelyn and Katelyn, you'll have first crack at answering, but we might chime in as well. And let's just jump right into it. I'm going to kick us off with this first question. What are the primary differences between applying as a deferred versus a traditional applicant, both as a candidate and from an AdCom perspective? Whoever wants to take that first.
Okay, I can start. So the deferred enrollment program is one pathway to an MBA program. And then the regular MBA process, we just kind of call it the regular MBA process, is another way into an MBA program. The important thing to know is that the experience that you have in an MBA program, whether you came through the deferred pathway or whether you came through the regular pathway, is the same. Once you arrive on your MBA program's campus or grounds, as we say at UVA, you are an MBA student. There's no differentiation. But for those of you who are undergraduate students who see an MBA as part of your future, who know that that's the pathway you'll be taking, it's really nice to be able to apply early while you're still in school and know where you're going, have that insurance card in your back pocket, and have the application process behind you.
Katelyn, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, one thing I would just note, and this is definitely a question that I get, is around eligibility for the programs. So the deferred programs pretty much across the board are for graduating seniors. So those who are receiving their degree in the spring of the year, or December grads who graduated, maybe they were on a non-traditional schedule. They're also typically available for graduate students who are in their final year of a graduate program. Very importantly, though, who went directly from undergrad to grad and did not have a full-time work experience or a position in between. And in that case, you would be eligible to apply again in the year that your graduate degree is being conferred. And I know I get that question sometimes, and you want to make sure that you check eligibility, especially for the specific programs, so that you don't miss the boat or so that you're not applying sooner than you should be, depending on your personal circumstance.
I'll make one additional note. Speaking of questions, we get a lot of topics that we get questions about, and that would be dual degrees. So many people are interested in dual degrees now, and most other schools do not have deferred programs. That there are exceptions, but for the majority of graduate programs, they do not offer a deferred program. So generally speaking, you would apply to the MBA program through the deferred process and then wait to apply to the other school when you're ready to matriculate.
It's definitely more of a North American phenomenon, mostly in the US. I do think there might be a couple schools in Canada these days offering, but Katelyn, you probably know your competition the best. How many schools out there are doing this?
In terms of offering the deferred pathway, I would say most top schools have a deferred enrollment program. But the schools I could list off the top of my head at this point, I could probably get up to 12.
I was going to say 12 too, Catherine. I think you're right on. The one that I actually discovered relatively recently is IESC is providing, they call it the Future Leaders Path. But otherwise, you're right, Eric, it is mostly a North American phenomenon.
You guys bring up one of you brought up this in this interesting way of looking at it as an insurance policy, right? I think that's a really great way of looking at it. So can you talk a little bit about that? And I imagine that falls within the sort of the thinking of the advantage of applying to a 2+2 program for the applicant.
Yeah, and I'll jump in because that's a conversation I have a lot. What's the motivation, especially as you're articulating, your narrative and your reasons for not only wanting to pursue an MBA, but why a deferred program? And specifically, it's helpful because what a lot of my fellows and students that I work with share is that it provides them a sense of freedom to take risks that they maybe otherwise wouldn't professionally. So for example, I have many fellows who are entering like 2-year more traditional analyst programs, but who are going to take another year or maybe 2 to pursue something different, whether that's working for a startup or maybe launching something on their own. And knowing, like Katelyn mentioned, that they have that sort of security safety net, if you will, that no matter what, they know at the end of those 3 or 4 years. And I think we're going to talk about the deferral period. So I'd say that's probably the biggest driver in terms of professional freedom that it gives many of the candidates who pursue that option.
And not only taking risks with the role that you take on, but also within your role. I have found that our students feel more confidence in making bigger decisions, making riskier decisions, bigger risk, bigger reward, because they know that whatever happens, they can go to business school.
That's a great teaching in general, right? Like if you have something set that's happening in like a year or 2, even if it's not business school, but you know that you're doing that thing, that could actually promote you to take those bigger risks and be unreasonable, right? In like the most positive way. And so I think that's a pretty interesting life lesson. We often talk about the process of the application being like business school and business school like being like life, right? So I think that they all interconnect. So we just talked about how the 2+2 program is great for the applicant. How are there advantages for the schools?
Katelyn, I don't know if you want to talk about that. The one thing I would add, just one more benefit that I think sometimes people don't always think about is that once a student is committed and admitted through a deferred program, they then have access to that community and that network and those resources. So even before they matriculate, and that certainly varies from school to school, how much they're going to be engaged, but that's a way to start realizing the benefit of an MBA program prior to matriculating throughout the deferral period. So I just wanted to include that because I think sometimes students are like, oh yeah, I forgot. I'm going to be able to tap into that pretty much starting from once they commit and are admitted and decide to matriculate. So Katelyn, I'll let you take it from there from the institutional perspective, although I'm happy to provide some thoughts on that as well when you're finished.
And before Katelyn says that, I just want to make one thing clear. Sorry to interrupt, because I know we've been calling it 2+2 or deferred. Just to clarify for the audience that 2+2 is the name that one school calls it, a famous school, Harvard. But the more broad term is deferred enrollment program, which is what I believe they're calling it Darden, just to set you up properly for the question, Katelyn.
Oh yeah, no problem. It's a common term, so I'm used to it. But in terms of from the school's perspective, I think that we meet with a lot of really eager undergraduate students who are ready to working toward their graduate degree goals. And in the past, before these programs, we had to say, come back in a few years, go work and come back in a few years. And it's really nice for schools to be able to say, we're so excited to meet you. We're so glad you're thinking about this option for your future, and we have a pathway that you can take today to help you get to the MBA in your future. It's also nice for schools to be able to go meet with undergraduate students when they are in this crux of trying to figure out what to do with their lives and weighing different options, career options and graduate school options. And now we are able to have a voice in that process of being able to talk to undergraduate students about what an MBA program is all about, where we didn't have as much of a platform prior to the existence of these programs. We really didn't start to encounter them until they've been working for a few years.
I can imagine, obviously, it takes some of the pressure off if you can take some risks, like Bara was saying earlier, but that doesn't come without a cost, right? Like if you're investing all the time needed during your undergraduate years to prepare for the GMAT, to do the proper research, to build those relationships, networking, and all that kind of, all the key elements that go into being a strong applicant, those are still there for for deferred enrollment candidates. So like you're compromising some of that time, often, at least in the States, university years are for personal development, for learning other things, for having a good time, for maybe doing community service, travel, like lots of stuff. And I wonder if you have any comments about that. Particularly, I was thinking, Katelyn, as somebody who works with people, how do you advise them to manage their time or to divide their attention or to still have that full university experience and be an effective candidate?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's actually one of the fundamental things that I talk about before they begin the process, and certainly before they begin our program. So we provide a coaching program through the application process, supporting them as they're preparing, which takes place 6 months to a year before they're actually submitting their application. So I've now been working with a group for the past, like I say, 6 to 10 months in some cases. So the number one thing is to be really intentional and clear and understanding about what a heavy lift it is, because you're absolutely right. Just because you're applying through a deferred program doesn't mean that the requirements aren't still really intense and time consuming. Probably the biggest is test prep. And that's the one that almost all of them struggle with, not just in terms of like achieving the score that they want, but really underestimating how much lead time it takes, depending on what type of preparation, whether they're taking a class or if they're doing self-study, providing time for a retake, which many of them need at least a couple. So that's the number one piece of feedback I get is I wish I started earlier. I wish I understood what I needed to do and not just waiting until, a couple months before the deadline. So I'd say that's the biggest thing. But on a more practical level, I also remind them that, the deadlines tend to be, we're actually right in the middle of deadline season right now. They start, the earliest tends to be April 10th-ish, 11th this year, all the way up until the 27th. So this is really like game time to pull everything together. And this is also the time that they're finishing their courses. They are coming back from spring break. They are trying to, finish finals in preparation for graduation. So I tell them, like, you have to be willing to make some of those trade-offs and you have to think about the sacrifices that you'll have to make. And not everybody's ready to do that. And that's okay. And that's what I remind them. The deferred program is a fantastic option, but it's not necessarily the right option for everyone. And so I have a lot of conversations with folks trying to figure out for themselves, like, am I willing to give up my spring break to stay home and prep for my GMAT if that's, what I need to do? And I have students that do it lots of different ways. I did get, funnily enough, one of my fellows, this was a couple of years ago, sent me a picture of him like on a jet ski on spring break. And he's like, I promise, coach, like I'm studying, for the GMAT. And I was like, oh my goodness. And of course it all worked out for him. But I say that because I think sometimes they're not necessarily thinking about that because spring of senior year in college is a really special, pivotal time. And doing this is a really pivotal process as well. And sometimes they can, I don't want to say be in conflict, but certainly require some trade-offs. So those are a lot of the conversations I have around that.
I will say
part of the message is like, get spring break out of the way during high school and make homecoming queen by sophomore year. This way you can do this your junior year.
Sure.
Though, I got to say that if you plan it, you can actually have a wonderful spring break and study. And really life is about having that balance. Mm-hmm. And so, we don't want, like when we're working with GMAT students, we don't want them to cram in 2 or 3 months. We actually want them to have time that they are socializing. So if they could figure that out, it's actually going to be better for the end product, right? The deliverable of a great score, because they're not cramming.
Yeah. I'd like to point out two differentiators at Darden. And we do think of the GMAT and GRE as one data point for academic readiness, but definitely not the only data point. So we actually don't require the GMAT or GRE for the deferred enrollment program. We do require a test. Students need to submit an SAT or ACT. And if they do not apply with a GMAT or GRE, majority of our students do apply with a GMAT or GRE. But for those who are super crazy busy, we feel like there are other ways to assess their academic readiness for the program than the standardized test. And we also have a second application deadline. So our first application deadline was April 11th, in line with the other programs, but we have a second deadline of August 1st for any students who feel like they need a little bit of time over the summer to get ready academically with a standardized test to put their best foot forward in the application process.
What about a student who, like, it's very much a trend now to go to community college for 2 years? Like, it's very popular in California, and then transfer over to Berkeley, right? Transfer over to one of the state schools. What do you do with a student like that? Do they have to then take the GRE or the GMAT?
They would have to have a test as part of their application packet. So they don't have an SAT or ACT, they do need to take the GMAT or GRE.
They can't take the SAT or the ACT, can they?
That's a great question. This is the first time I've had that question, but I would say no.
All right,
So
should we
I'm
answer the question about that came in from Dr. Corcoran? She asked what kind of risks they were taking. This is what we were talking about earlier, and she was asking about some specific examples, if anyone wants to share some.
One of our students worked for a venture capital firm and decided that after he had a couple of years working in VC, he wanted to go work with the startup that they were coaching. And the startup wasn't able to guarantee that he would have a long-term job in that organization. So because he knew he didn't need a long-term job because he was going to business school, he felt like he could leave the comfort of the VC and go into the startup space before going to business school. So that's one example. I have another student who was a brand manager of a product and felt like she didn't give me specific examples of the risks that she took, but she made bigger decisions with the product that she was managing because she knew she was going to business school in a year or two.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of someone, one of my fellows who I believe is working for Bain and was able to take advantage of like a global reassignment. So she could gain some international experiences that she wanted to do. And it's not that she wouldn't have done that necessarily, but she just had a different calculation to make, understanding what it would mean to be gone for 6 months from her first position, just a few years out of college. And so again, she had the latitude to do that, knowing that she was going to defer, or she was going to enter after her 3-year deferral period.
Yeah,
I continually think of the MBA as like your one train ticket to anywhere. You get on the train and you can take it in any direction. And so before you hop on the train, it's important to know where you want it to go. And so the years before you go to business school are what I call your exploratory years. You're a lot more affordable for a company before you have an MBA. So try some different experiences out, learn what you like, learn what you don't like, try some different industries, try some different functions, and put it all together before you begin your MBA and head in a specific direction.
Right. So I have this question for, both of you, like students this young, do they understand the gravity of the MBA? In terms of like, probably whom they're like going to rub their shoulders with, like people with 5 years, 6 years, and even 7, 8 years of work experience, and also the kind of roles they will get. So how do you coach your, prospective candidates for this?
Well, I would answer that in 2 ways. I guess the first part of it is that once, they're deferring. So when they enter, they're kind of at that level, having a few years of work experience. So it's not like they're entering as a senior in college. I think the difference is the Yale Silver Scholars Program works a little bit differently, where they divide up the years of study. But for the other traditional deferred, they are following sort of the same path. They're just getting their offer sooner. So I'm not sure that they've reflected to me that that's an issue. Catherine, you may be able to speak to that. But the second piece is that there was a second part of the question that you asked Krithika, do you mind repeating? You said
Right. So how do you coach them for understanding like the importance of the MBA?
the importance. Yeah. And
When we still like, we're still applying,
right. What I was going to also mention is that many of them have had really substantive internship experiences. So because of that, oftentimes they're in that world, they're talking to people, they have a little bit more knowledge about that than maybe you would think that they would. So I think from that perspective, they have some understanding. So they're not going into it completely blind, even though they're much younger than a traditional candidate who's been working in a full-time environment. Many of them are getting that from an internship experience, just talking to other people who have MBAs or who are on that track.
Yeah, we do a lot of coaching once students have been admitted and are in the deferral period. Our Career Center offers a Design Your Life workshop for the students in the deferral period, which is super helpful. And just trying to communicate information to our future year scholars about what recruiting is looking like for our MBA program. So our program requires students to work for anywhere between 2 and 5 years. But it's important for me to communicate that our tech companies, our tech recruiters are really looking for a minimum of 3 years of professional experience. And so continuing to share what we're seeing in terms of who the companies are hiring and helping them think about their resume in relationship to the students who are getting the roles with the firms they want to work for is part of our job working with our deferred students.
That winds up being super interesting. That winds up being super interesting because, and that course that you mentioned sounds fantastic because you're basically curating yourself, not just for yourself and for what's coming up in business school, but what comes after. So if you wind up doing some sort of volunteer project, let's say in a developing country, or, devoting yourself to a passion project for those 2 years, how is that going to affect what happens after business school? Because from what you're saying, that some of these tech companies are probably not going to necessarily want that, right? So if that's okay with you, and then you have to just do due diligence after the MBA, are you going to want to do it then, right? So it's a really interesting, it puts the student in a really interesting position about how they want to curate those 2 years.
Yeah, Catherine, that class sounds amazing. Is it open to the public, like Designing Your Life? I feel like we could all use something like that.
Krithika, if we can't hear you, you're on mute.
So sorry, like I was going to say, can I sign up for it as well? Sounds so cool.
I have some connections.
Like,
I'll squeeze you in.
I was curious as to, like Bara said, students can't take a gap year or go backpacking during this time then, right? So they do need that 2 years of solid work experience.
Yeah, so many students come and ask us, like, what can I do? What can I do? Oh, how can I spend my time? Like, what do you want to see, et cetera? And it's really not us and what we want to see, it's what recruiters want to see. We want to see our students land successfully on the other side of the MBA experience. And while your undergraduate recruiting experience is very heavily based on your experiences as a student, your MBA recruiting starts so early. You've hardly had any MBA classes by the time you start meeting with recruiters. And so what they're interested in hearing about is what you have done and the impact you have made before an MBA program. So if you are not in a role long enough to make an impact, if you're not in a role long enough to gain a promotion, if you're not in a role long enough to take on management leadership responsibilities, it can be really tough once you get to the recruiting journey in an MBA program. So we're trying to communicate that message and coach our students to seek out those opportunities prior to matriculation.
I totally agree with you, Catherine. I mean, I often talk to my clients, and back when I worked at a business school, about the fact that, you compared those early years of work as like a train, right? I often call it a vehicle, or even the degree itself a vehicle, and it's all to get you to a specific destination. So you better, if you want to go to the moon, better not be in a boat. You want to be in the right vehicle, but it's also a bridge, right? Like the degree, any kind of degree is a bridge to get you from where you are today to that future version of yourself, right? And so very often you may need or just want to take take steps to position yourself so that you be to narrow the gap a little bit more. Because if the gap is like this, there's no bridge that's going to span it, right? So that could be staying a little bit longer at a job to gain those leadership experiences. And you can correct me if you don't agree, but leadership doesn't necessarily have to be managing people. It could be project management, product management, managing budgets, and so forth. So any kind of leadership experience will contribute to your attractiveness as a candidate for employment post MBA. And it's exactly right. I mean, I think every school would agree that it's not just about admissions. It's not just about making sure and assessing, can these people handle our academics and be good students, but are they going to be, gainfully employed post degree? That is absolutely pivotal to the statistics, reputation, brand, ranking, everything to the school, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I had a conversation with one of our very wise admitted students the other day, and he had decided he wanted to matriculate in August. And he called me and he said, you know what, after some self-reflection, I realized that my matriculating is me running away from my current job because I just don't want to do it anymore. Mm. And he said, I think I'll get more out of my experience once I know what I'm running to or running toward. He said, I need another year to figure out what I really want, so that I'm coming in with a plan rather than as an exit strategy for my current position. And I thought that was really wise and smart.
Yeah.
And speaking of
go ahead, Krithika.
Okay. Speaking of running towards something, and we're talking about seniors still in college who just have internship experiences. While they may know how the world of management consulting, product management, or even supply chain management might look like, they may not have a clear idea of what it takes to get there. So what do you expect to see when they're talking about the goals?
I really focus on leadership. I think an MBA is a degree in leadership. And if you are someone who's drawn to organizations and you're drawn to being leadership traits, then an MBA is most likely going to be a part of your future. And so I don't need you to know exactly what it is you're going to do with your MBA or exactly what you're going to do before an MBA, but being able to have the self-reflection and being able to say, I've identified these traits and I've exercised them in these ways through clubs and activities and internships. And therefore, I see my career path going down a path that's going to require an MBA in the future, whether it be supply chain or whether it be finance or whether it be in consulting, I don't know yet. But because of my leadership style or leadership traits, this is going to be part of my future. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Yeah.
I would add.
I think
Go ahead, Katelyn.
I was just going to add one thing that while it's a different kind of work experience, and I mentioned this earlier, I'm always really impressed by, how much my fellows and clients that I've worked with have learned through their internship experiences, right? And that's certainly not the same thing as working post-undergrad for 5 years in a position, but I think those who are most competitive for these programs are pretty savvy. And they have, again, had really substantive experiences. Many of my folks have gotten the return offers. And so they're going back there. They know what they're signing on for the next few years. Of course, that's not true for everyone. But I think that for those who are on this path and have that focus, that's the case more times than not. So.
I always joke that my senior year of college, I was not meeting with people like me, people in the role that I'm currently in. And so I'm always blown away by how on top of things the students that are applying to these sorts of programs are. They're way ahead of the curve. And regardless of the results of their application, I think it's such a productive experience to walk through, a productive journey to go down. It's one that requires a lot of self-reflection and contemplation over the choices you've made for your life thus far and what they say about you and who you're becoming. And that's going to be valuable, whether it be for getting into a graduate degree program or getting a job. Those are just really great skills for life.
I totally agree, Catherine. I was too busy winning Homecoming Queen back when I was in college. But anyway, I kind of wanted to come back to something we were speaking about earlier. Again, talking about risks, and you were talking about that, that train metaphor. You're saying, those early years, those kind of formative years in your career, you're talking about try this, sector, try this function, try this, these kind of things. And I wondered, how does this appear to you on the admissions side? Do you see some of that as also perhaps a bit, I don't know if the word wishy-washy or scattered or not focused. You know what I mean? Because maybe it's different in Darden or in the States versus Europe, but I've heard different opinions about that. I'd like to hear what your take is.
It totally depends on the story. As long as you can connect the dots and say, while these things appear to have nothing in common, this is what moved me from this place to that place, then it's fantastic and probably really interesting and compelling. But if it's just like I was wandering aimlessly, and so I just hopped from one stone to the next, just trying to see what I could uncover, less exciting. So it's more about the story that you're telling.
I switched that over a little bit too quickly. I just wanted to respond to you. Yes, thank you for confirming the way I operate with my clients. I mean, that expression, hindsight is always 2020, right? Looking back, things look clear. And very often opportunities present themselves. And it doesn't mean you didn't earn them, because I think a lot of us who are particularly good at networking and so forth, we've created opportunities and doors have just opened naturally that way versus the traditional route of going on Monster or hunting around for jobs and so on. And maybe it can appear a bit random, but it's, again, all about that story you tell, which is why the essays are so important, why, the process of building relationships with people in admissions, with alumni and so forth, that you get to tell that story where you get to make sense of it all. Mm-hmm. And maybe you weave together a meandering thread, but still it tells the story that this was actually quite intentional, because I was looking to have this experience and that. I learned this is what I love, this is what I don't like, and that has shaped the professional I want to be in the future by going for this MBA program.
One thing I would add that I feel like is a little bit different, and Katelyn, it'll be interesting for you as you're reviewing applications. So this is the second year that we have at MLT launched our EA, our early access program for deferred applicants. But this year's graduating seniors, pretty much like the whole first almost 2/3 of their college experience was characterized by the pandemic. And so it's interesting to see how that's influencing the story that they tell, because many of them had online internships and they had to approach what would have been kind of the traditional college summers like very differently, or because they were doing remote learning and they were off campus, so they couldn't engage in activities in the same way, or they had to manage their leadership role differently. So that's sort of, a legacy of just where we're at as a society, but it's just going to be interesting to see how that plays in the admissions process. And then once they come to, the MBA programs 3-4 years down the road as well. So that's been a really interesting element for me, because I've coached and I worked in admissions for so many years, kind of before times, and then now seeing what I don't want to call it after times, but kind of moving beyond, at least to the next phase of it. That's been really interesting.
Did you have a comment, Katelyn?
Mm-hmm. No, it's making me think about a conference I went to this summer where they were talking about, or this winter, where they were talking about students having so many virtual internships and not feeling like a virtual internship counted as a legitimate internship. But I think that there is still a way for these students to make impacts on organizations, even if it was virtual. And I think it's important for the students to realize that everybody was in the same boat. So for the round of students that are applying the same year they are, everybody went through the same thing. And so it's more what you made of it rather than what you've experienced.
What I've seen with the interns that I work with the kind of a rotating group of interns at lots of different schools who are completing their degree. And because COVID has forced them to allow remote or online internships, they've kind of stuck with them. Others have come back. Maybe it's like 50-50 at this point, but I've lots of people from schools all over the world who are completing degrees where online internships are allowed. And I suppose that's going to kind of graduate into the workforce as well, more and more experiences and opportunities working as well as we.
And what I've seen is, like, for some people who are able to manage this well, they were able to explore many fields. So there were like a couple of them who were like also people applying for deferred programs who wanted to try product management and management consulting. And because of the ability to have a virtual internship, they were able to try this, and this would have never happened otherwise. So there are people who have taken advantage of the fact that it was virtual. So I guess it's a question of how they see it again.
I often say in admissions, and you all know this being on both sides of the desk, but it's all about spin, and not in a manipulative way, right? But the notion that it's how you present it and how you talk about it, whether it's a liability or an asset. And so that's a lot of the coaching that I do. Like, okay, well, here's something that you feel like is going to work against you. Like, how can we spin that and think about talking about it in a more constructive way so we can really show the value that you actually got out of it? And it takes some time. Like, it's not always straightforward. But I feel like that's really one of the fundamental things as you're going through the admissions process. And sometimes they need help with that. Remembering it's not counting against them, right? Or it's not going to put them behind the 8 ball. So.
Absolutely. So there are people who get rejected from these, right? And when they come and apply for the MBA program, would you still have their applications from before, and would you be comparing?
We prefer to say denied, not rejected. I don't know, Katelyn, if you're going to say that. Every time I hear rejected, I'm like, ooh, that makes it sound so much worse. But yeah,
I was going to say the same thing, Katelyn. Yes.
No, I'll let you take that, Katelyn, and then I can chime in after.
Yeah, I think of a deny as a not now, not a not ever. And some of the deferred programs have a clear preference for people from specific backgrounds, industry backgrounds in particular. And just because you're not admitted doesn't mean that we don't think that you're going to be a great student in the future. But if you think about it, in admissions, we have fewer data points for students applying to the deferred enrollment programs. And so sometimes there just isn't enough data for us to be comfortable with an admit now, but with a couple of years of work experience, perhaps a new standardized test, we can gain confidence in an offer. And so I like to see someone apply, and then if they're not admitted, kind of work at bettering their application and coming back to us, showing grit and determination and motivation and commitment and an interest in our school. I think those are really great qualities, and sometimes I get more excited about our the students who are reapplying than the people who are applying for the first time for those reasons.
And just to follow up on the point I just made about spin, some people feel like, well, the HBS is going to see that they already denied me once, and so that's going to count against me. And again, what I suggest or I encourage them to think about is, or they see that you are so interested and you are so committed, and it is hard to go back after you've been told no or you've been told not now, right? So to have that grit, Katelyn, that you mentioned, to be able to demonstrate really strong interest, like I'm going to keep coming back, that is exactly what they want to see from their MBA students. So it's taking what seems like a negative or something that's going to count against you and really flipping on its head and being able to capitalize on it and making it a strength. So that's a perfect example through reapplication, especially with the deferred programs, because the phrase I always use with my students and my clients is it's all icing, right? Like everything that we're doing now, they're not missing the boat on it. This is not the only opportunity. And I think sometimes they can, because they're such high achievers, many of them, they're movers, they're shakers. They always are used to being at the head of the class and they feel like I'm falling behind. And I just try to remind them that you're not, great if this works and okay if it doesn't. So it's all icing. That's what I'm often reminding them of.
I have a foundational question that we haven't really covered because we've only talked about the folks applying being in their senior year, right? And that's when they would actually be considering this not a gap, but this deferred enrollment. What happens if someone is in, let's say, a 5-year undergrad MA program, or they actually are in a different master's program? Can they also be considered for that deferment program, and what does that look like?
Yes, as long as the students have not had a full-time professional work experience, schools are considering those students as eligible for the deferred enrollment program. The idea is just to get them before they start working full-time.
The one thing that I have discovered, and this is, depending on your particular situation, but I've been working through this with a couple of my fellows, some people who are doing like a 5-year program where they're going to stay for an additional year. I have one fellow who's doing a co-term, and the co-term enables him to basically have completed the master's. So he has to take one more class this summer. So in that case, he's eligible to apply now. And I think I mentioned that in the beginning of our conversation. There are so many ins and outs that I would recommend somebody who's in that situation to contact the admissions folks and have a conversation so that they make sure that they're not missing the boat, depending on the deferral date. And it gets really like kind of nuanced and everyone's situation's a little bit different. And so, like I say, I'm managing this now. And I think really talking to the admissions folks is probably the best for the programs that they're interested in applying to, is the best bet.
So how do candidates typically engage with their chosen program during that pre-MBA deferral period?
I think, Katelyn, you were talking about that, and I know Darden does such a fantastic job with it. It does vary from school to school, but Katelyn, I always hear from our Darden folks like how just they already feel a part of the community. So you can maybe talk about how you all do that, and I can talk about the other programs.
Yay, I'm glad that you hear that, because that's our intent, and it does vary from school to school in terms of resources they have allocated to working with this population. By large, the MBA career centers are staffed to support students with MBA jobs. So for deferred enrollment students who are looking for job support, you're probably not going to find that in a deferral period. But what our career team is able to do and has been doing very effectively is doing some coaching for our admitted students around, okay, I have this offer and this offer, which one's going to help me reach my end goal? How do I negotiate for more money? Is now the right time to come back to get my MBA, or should I wait and work for another year or two? So we have that kind of coaching available to our future year scholars. All of our programs have some sort of social media platform where they can connect through like Discord or WhatsApp, so you can meet other admitted students to the program that you're attending. We also all offer some sort of networking events in person. This is usually in large cities. So for Darden, anytime we're traveling and hosting an event for prospective students or alumni, we invite our future year scholars, consider them as part of our network already. Our alumni clubs are inviting them to all of their holiday and summer parties as well. I've seen future year scholars get job offers from alums they've networked with at these events. And frankly, it's been helpful for them when thinking about when to matriculate. We had a student in Atlanta who was gung-ho on coming after 2 years of work experience and went to an alumni event and saw how much older all of the alumni were and thought, maybe I should wait a few more years before I come. And so it was helpful for that reason as well. So the events, the networking on the platforms, and then we do things like Design Your Life every summer to help our students think about their future. And we have different sessions with our career team thinking about consulting. These are the things that you should be thinking about doing now before you matriculate, things of that nature.
Awesome. That's great to know. I love it. And maybe Katelyn wants to share what she knows about some of the other schools out there, just so we get a broad perspective of what people might expect depending where they go.
Yeah, I think at the other, I don't know if I call it the other extreme, but there are other programs, some of whom are available. There's usually a point person who will communicate through the deferral period with their folks, but who are sort of hands off, who, make resources available, but you're not intended to engage. There's not an expectation. I think it's sort of there if you want or need it, but the idea is that you will become part of the community more so when you decide to matriculate. So it's a little bit different than some of what Katelyn had shared.
Awesome. Good to know. And another question popped up on our radar here, just to ask about what should a candidate do if they have a job offer while applying for a deferred program? What do you have to say about that?
So, Katelyn, I'm really interested to hear what you say, because many of the deferred programs, and we do info sessions with all of them, and many of them will say it's not required that deferred candidates have a job secured when they apply. And while I think that's true, I have to be honest that in my experience, the most successful people have had job offers, at least, if not had already secured their job or made a commitment to their job by the time they were applying. So I don't know, I guess we're kind of talking out of both sides of our mouth, because I don't think you have to have everything perfectly, carved in stone. But going back to something we talked about earlier, I think, and I had an experience with a fellow who was trying to recruit at the same time he was prepping for the GMAT, at the same time he was trying to write essays, and it was just a lot. So there's sort of a practical reason why that can be challenging, but then also in terms of what you're presenting and the clarity that you can present to the AdCom, I think the admissions committee, I think, again, in my experience, I found that those who have a clear path, at least for that, initial first job out of college, have just been the most successful through the process. So Katelyn, I'll let you sort of maybe offer the balancing perspective.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think that schools do like to see a path, and schools do like to see a plan. And so while there is no requirement for you to have a job offer, we want to know what you're thinking about. So on our application, we ask if you do have an offer, or what are your plans. So sometimes people will say, well, I'm weighing offers from these companies, but I'm still waiting to hear back from X, Y, or Z. If you say you want to go into investment banking and it is the spring of your senior year and you don't have a job offer, that's not good. But if you're looking to do a career path that is with an organization that hires on an as needed basis, and you have a plan for why you want to work in a particular industry that hires later in the process, it's totally unexpected that you wouldn't have your offer at this point. What we don't want to see is, I have no idea what I want to do. There needs to be some sort of a plan. The majority of our applicants do have a job offer by April, but I have seen compelling candidates who don't, because what they want to do just hires later.
This also just came in related to what you were just saying, Katelyn, from Dr. Corcoran. She asked, how does the job a college senior has lined up post-bac, so baccalaureate, figure into the admissions decision?
I would say, in my experience, I think it's the story, right? It's the story and it's the plan. So if, you've spent 4 years, in a business school as a business major, and, there's sort of a path that you might expect, but I think it's more importantly, it's how you talk about that, right? So if you're making the decision to go into a 2-year analyst program, like, what's your thinking around that? What skills are you trying to build? How is that informing the next step that you might want to take? If you have, a longer term version of being an entrepreneur, like, how does it fit into that? So I think it's not so much like, oh, that's a good job and you get extra points for it, or that's a bad job and you don't. It's just, does it make sense based on the plan and way that you're thinking and your interests, right? So we use this term a lot, but it's like the cohesive narrative, the way that you connect the dots. That was a term that Katelyn used that we use a lot as well. So it's a little bit, hard to answer that directly, but it is showing that you're thinking really strategically and just being thoughtful as much as possible.
I'll admit that I know that there are some companies out there that have more stringent recruiting and interviewing processes for their undergraduate hires than others. So when we see students who have job offers with some of these companies that are really hard to get job offers for, I'm impressed. But I'm also more impressed by why someone's doing what they're doing than what it is that they're doing. And so you can make a great case for looking for a small startup, because you are going to be able to get your hands involved in a little bit of marketing and operations and finance. You do a little bit of everything, versus working for a massive organization where you're just a little peon in the big scale of things and you're just doing one specific job function. So again, it goes back to story. You can make a strong case for doing just about anything. So it's more about the why than the what.
Yeah.
So, and I have a quick, question here, hearing all this. Have you tried comparing the success rates of the candidates who came through deferred enrollment versus candidates who came through the other stream? Is there anything that shows the difference?
Most of the programs at this point are pretty new. We've had our second group graduate from that entered through DART and through the deferred enrollment pathway 3 were going to MBB and 1 was going to Amazon. So it looked pretty much like the rest of the class. But as we continue to get more data, that will be something that I will be tracking and very interested to see.
Mhm.
Sorry, Eric, you
I
muted.
just realized I was on mute. I was going to ask, is that kept confidential, or is it the candidate's decision or the student's decision to disclose if he or she's been admitted through the deferred enrollment pathway, or is that just clearly visible to all?
It's up to the student to disclose, but it's something they're usually proud of. Like, hey, you're a future year. I'm a future year. Yeah. Like a little bond that they have because they apply to the same pathway and have probably been connecting before that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I would also say, and I don't know, Katelyn, if you agree with this, but deferred admissions is really competitive. And so there is definitely sort of a kind of badge of honor, if you will, that you were a standout and able to pursue that pathway. So I think if anything, there's not like a reticence, but instead that sort of excitement. And I see it on all the LinkedIn profiles, like as soon as they, have their offer 3 years in advance that they're going to be at GSB in 2027, so.
And I would say it is like brag-worthy. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
I also going to say that, do you think it's harder to get into, to the regular pathway or this one, like how Katelyn had mentioned? But Katelyn, do you think it's easier to get into through the deferred enrollment or the other way?
Well, you have a little bit more time to get your stuff together for the regular MBA process. But if you're someone who's already has all your stuff together by the time you're a senior in college, then go for it. But some students feel like they need a little bit more time to demonstrate their abilities than applying through the deferred pathway. We like to think of it as pretty equal. If you look at our student profile, the GPA is a little bit higher for our students admitted through the Future Year Scholars pipeline. The standardized testing is harder to calculate since we have a number that come in with ACT and SATs, but it's pretty close to the same profile as our MBA program.
I will also add one thing that I think is important to note, and it's going back to, the motivation for creating these programs. For many of the schools, it was to increase diversity, just straight up. And so what's important about that is that they're taking into account, as they do through traditional, but especially understanding through the deferred, first generation, those coming from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, those who may not otherwise be on the pathway for an MBA, underrepresented minorities. And so, it doesn't mean, and I often remind my fellows that doesn't mean that you have an automatic advantage or that, the standards are going to be different. But many of the schools are very transparent about the fact that that's an important part of the process. Again, as it is for traditional, the same is true for deferred as well.
And about scholarships, how do they get scholarships?
So that varies from school to school. At Darden, we do consider all of our future year scholars for a small award, around $30,000 to $40,000 at the time that they apply to the deferred enrollment program. But the scholarship money from school to school varies from year to year. A lot of the money that's used for scholarships is invested in the market. So the amount of money schools have to spend on scholarships varies from year to year. So schools are reluctant to allocate a guaranteed amount of that scholarship funding to students they don't even know when they're matriculating. And so the schools prefer to sometimes have people have a small award at the beginning, but then all of the schools will consider the deferred admits for the full portfolio of MBA scholarships in the year in which they plan to matriculate after they've indicated their plan to matriculate.
Yeah. And then there are some special, yes, that's absolutely true. And that's been my experience. And I often will set the expectation with my fellows that you're going to get an offer, but you're not going to have a scholarship offer, but you'll have that information before or when you matriculate, obviously. The other thing is some programs, like I'm thinking about Wharton's MOLIS program, for example, if you are matriculating to the MOLIS program from their undergraduate program, it's an automatic $10,000. So like there are certain, baked in awards that are included if you apply to, or if you attend HBS's SVMP program, then you are guaranteed an award if you end up matriculating to 2+2. So there are, some opportunities like that as well. But for the most part, the straight merit funding will come and be awarded in the year that they matriculate.
And to that point, we do see admitted students retake a GMAT or GRE after they've been admitted to increase the chances of receiving additional scholarship.
Oh, yeah.
That's quotable.
Put this to Katelyn, right? I heard that, Bara. To Katelyn as a more neutral person to ask this question to. Have you heard people who have, gone through the deferred enrollment program and been admitted, and then in the meanwhile, first of all, it's a kind of twofold question. If they paid a kind of deposit where there's some kind of financial commitment on their part, and then if they decide to go and apply to another school that they perceive as a better option, or, for whatever reason, it's more of a fit for them, forfeiting that deposit, can they get it refunded? Is there some kind of clause where they're not allowed to apply to other schools? What's going on there? I think this is a good behind the scenes.
Yeah, that absolutely happens, right? We don't necessarily promote them doing that. However, life changes, right? Like things happen over the course of a few years. There could be a personal circumstance that will require them to be in one location that they didn't realize when they applied and secured their offer 3 years earlier. So yes, that does happen. All deposits are non-refundable. The amount of the deposit varies from school to school. Some will require a deposit each year to continue to hold your spot. But there is not a contract, to the best of my knowledge, and Catherine, correct me if you know otherwise, but there is no document or contract that you're signing that requires you or precludes you from reapplying to other schools and then eventually withdrawing, just the way, honestly, that a traditional does, right? I mean, you can submit your deposit, and then if you get off the wait list somewhere else, then you can just choose to forego and decline that offer. So the same is true with the deferred.
Yeah, I've definitely heard of situations where schools have bought out the deposit from another school where a student has been admitted to both, and they perceive this applicant as so strong that they really want to have them in the class, and they'll be willing to pay the whatever it is, $1,000 deposit. I don't know if that happens with a deferred, but for standard traditional admission, I've heard that.
There are some schools that do require their deferred admits not to deposit at another school. So if you're depositing through a deferred program, they don't want you depositing at multiple deferred programs.
At the same time, you mean?
At the same time.
Correct.
So it's not binding. You can still go somewhere else, but they don't want you in the holding pattern at 2 different schools.
Right.
So we are forcing students to make choices when they're not always ready to make choices.
Right. I often remind them too that, and this is true through the traditional as well, you can only choose one school, right? Like, I mean, that sounds fairly obvious. And so to be mindful and thoughtful about the other people in this process as well, right? It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, but if everyone's depositing at 5 different schools, I just try to think bigger picture and more broadly, like that's the way we want to have people thinking. So it doesn't benefit them, but importantly, it doesn't, it could be detrimental to their future classmates as well. So
am I hearing, Katelyn, if you want to be a sustainable leader, you should be sustainable among your MBA competition as well?
I mean, go figure, creating habits. It doesn't just happen once you graduate and you get into that like C-suite level position. Yes, absolutely. And I will often talk about the fact that the way that you comport yourself through the process, not only through your interactions, the way you handle declining an offer, the way you handle a scholarship negotiation, all of that is part of, your personal brand and like what you're bringing to the community. And it's really, really important. And I feel like sometimes I say that and it's so obvious. And then I realize, wow, it's actually not that obvious to everybody. So I have a lot of those conversations, like lead with gratitude, be gracious, like really, in my mind, fundamental things that we would look for in humans, but especially in future business leaders. So I'll get off my soapbox about that, but I say that often.
Thank you so much, Katelyn. And I'm gonna have to end the episode there because it is 8 o'clock here in Paris and it is 11 a.m. in San Francisco and et cetera around the world. So, guys, that was fascinating. Just a couple of quick takeaways. I think there are some serious and clear advantages to going for this kind of program. It allows you to take more risks. It allows you to just go for it if you're going to be that focused and motivated. Of course, that comes with some sacrifices that you're going to have to invest time and money into creating a strong application as a deferred enrollment applicant. But you can always apply later in a standard pathway later on after you've had a work experience. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you liked it, please give us a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to MBA Waves. Thank you so much, Katelyn, for being on the show today. You were fantastic and super interesting. We'd love to have you both back anytime. Katelyn, on any other topic you like. Catherine, we'd be happy to have an episode dedicated to Darden with a panel of mix of alum, current students, career services, whatever you want to do. We'll talk about that for another episode of MBA Waves. Don't forget to check our programming schedule on the website at mbawaves.com. See you next time. Same place. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.